So my central question is to try to explain what kind of conflicts produce suicide and why people who have these grievances express them through the act of their suicide rather than in some other way. There's a lot of different ways we can try to explain suicide. The most common, in modern America anyway, is through psychology or psychiatry. You ask people why suicide happens, they say depression. Fair enough, but this doesn't explain the kind of question I want to address. In sociology, we often go to the classical theory of Durkheim, which says people are more likely to commit suicide when they lack social integration, or when they have too much of it, or when society has failed to balance their desires with their means of achieving them. All these theories have their merits, but the topic I focus on, the question I ask, is best suited to the theoretical strategy developed by Professor Black in his theories of law and social control. This strategy involves explaining conflict with the social structure of the conflict itself. It recognizes that every conflict has a social structure defined by various distances and elevations in a social space. For instance, the parties in a conflict might be more or less socially distant from one another. This includes their relational distance, as defined by whether they have intimacy or they lack intimacy. For instance, spouses, close kin, good friends, they're relationally close. Mere acquaintances, strangers, they're relationally distant. It also includes cultural distance, the similarity of people's cultures. People from the same religion, ethnicity, nationality, culturally close, different religion, ethnicity, nationality, culturally different. Conflicts also have a status structure defined by whether there's inequality between the parties, how much is the extent of that inequality, and is the grievance upwards towards a status superior or downwards towards a status inferior? For example, someone who has a grievance against a wealthy, powerful organization has an upward grievance. If the organization that's wealthy and powerful has a grievance against me, it's downward. There are other relevant variables as well, but the core idea here is that structural factors like the distance between the disputants, so their status relative to one another, shape how the conflict is handled, whether the grievance is expressed through suicide, vengeance, protest, or some other tactic. Furthermore, changes in these variables help explain why grievances occur in the first place, why the conflicts erupt. Social space fluctuates constantly. People form new relationships, they grow more close. They end old relationships, they grow more distant. They lose jobs and change their status. They exert dominance over one another and increase their status. If we look closely, we see that these fluctuations of social space, what Black calls social time, provide the spark or the trigger for conflicts and for suicide. So the aim of my work from the dissertation onwards has been to try to specify what configurations of social space and social time lead to various kinds of suicidal conflict. Now, my aim in this talk is to present some broad theoretical ideas. This is not what you'd call your standard presentation of findings. But I do want to say a little bit about the empirical research I do and the evidence upon which these ideas are based. The questions I ask deal with the microstructure of conflicts and the microstructure of suicide. What issues sparked the grievance? What were the relationships between the people involved? This means that a lot of conventional data sources just aren't that useful to me. Much of the sociological research on suicide makes use of official statistics, compares the rates of different countries, or the same country over time, or different categories of people, such as what's the rate of men versus women, Protestants versus Catholics. The problem for me, of course, is they say very little about what's happening at the ground level. What issue sparked this suicide? If it was a conflict, who were the parties involved? One of the problems I faced when I started my dissertation research was not having this kind of data. And so I chose data sources that allowed me to see this ground level reality that described individual cases or patterns of cases. One source for me was the ethnographic literature from various cultures. And a particularly useful resource for anyone here who wants to study cross-cultural ethnography is a database called the Human Relations Area Files. It's an online database. The library should still have a subscription like they did when I was here 5 years ago. It contains thousands, literally thousands of ethnographic documents on hundreds of human societies And what makes it really cool is it's indexed and searchable at the paragraph level. So you can type in the word suicide or select suicide from their list of topics, and it brings up paragraphs in any ethnography that's talked about suicide, organized by what culture and society they're talking about. At this point, I've spent more time with that database than it's probably healthy. Speaking of unhealthy, another major source for me in my research was archival sources such as the records of coroners, medical examiners, and police reports. These are the basis of your official statistics, but they're unprocessed. You can get down and see the actual description that informants gave to homicide detectives. You can see suicide notes left by the victim and other information that gives you a window into the social context of the suicide. For example, for my dissertation, I looked through the coroner's records of a mid-sized southern city I agreed to keep confidential. I call it South Metro. No, it's not Richmond. I read through about 1,000 cases, and I found that about a third of these were sparked by some sort of interpersonal friction or conflict, including several dozen cases where people left notes dripping with hostility or in which they shot themselves in front of the person they were fighting with. I've already cited some examples from these sources in my talk, and the remainder of my talk is based on these data sources. In my published work, I've proposed several general relationships between aspects of social structure or kinds of social time and patterns of suicide. For the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to start off listing two here. One theoretical relationship that I've proposed is that in a conflict, suicide varies directly with the social closeness of the disputants, meaning that the closer they are relationally and culturally, the more likely they are to handle their grievance with suicide. Across various societies, from tribal societies to modern America, one finds that it's conflicts between spouses and close kin that account for the large majority of conflict due to suicide. And one also sees many examples of how the same grievance might be handled differently against a distant person than against a close person. For example, an ethnographer of suicide among Micronesian adolescents describes how adolescents will kill themselves due to over-strict discipline from their parents. But they're also disciplined by other adults in the community, including collateral relatives like aunts and uncles, pastors, teachers, and so forth. And this almost never provokes suicide. One example the author gives is that if a young man wants to marry a woman and his parents forbid the match, there's a very strong danger he might kill himself to protest that decision, versus if her parents object to the match, that would almost never happen. Another relationship I propose is that suicide increases with the superiority of the opponent. It happens in conflicts marked by stratification, differences in wealth, power, organization, authority. Muhammad Bouazizi's suicide is an example. In these conflicts, it tends to happen in an upward direction. It's a classic weapon of the weak, used by people against status superiors, against more powerful foes. Like any scientific theory, these relationships are proposed to hold all else equal, meaning if every other factor, such as the nature of the grievance or other variables in the theoretical system, is the same, I would predict more closeness means suicide is more likely. More inequality means suicide is more likely. The thing is, in real life, all else is rarely equal. We don't get these smooth continua of relationships in the empirical literature. What we find is that variables cluster. And with that clustering of independent variables produces certain patterns of suicide. And what I'd like to spend the rest of the talk addressing is three major patterns I've seen in the suicide literature. So I have this crude graph I'm going to use. The x-axis represents social distance, varying from intimate to distant, or close to distant, I should say. Cultural distance would also apply. I should have typos in your own slides. It's great. And the y-axis represents inequality, varying from equal to the opponent being a strong superior. So let's stop to consider protest suicide. The classic protest suicides, such as Quang Duc's self-immolation in Vietnam. Protest suicides tend to be against a relatively distant opponent. People aren't intimate with the state in the same way they are with friends and family. Sure, they interact with it to some extent, probably know the names of a few top officials. This is not a close relationship. But counterbalancing this lack of closeness is a very high degree of superiority. You can think of very few opponents more superior than the state. It's a large organization, a hierarchical superior, it has military power, greater wealth and resources. So protest suicides very clearly illustrate the upward direction of a suicidal grievance. The typical act of protest suicide expresses an intercollective grievance of some kind, a grievance on behalf of a collectivity. Sometimes citizens express grievances on behalf of all their fellow citizens, the nation as a whole. This seems to be the case with the rash of protest suicides in Bulgaria in 2013. At other times, it's on behalf of a particular subculture or social group, such as when Quang Duc killed himself on behalf of his fellow Buddhists, or Tibetans immolate themselves on behalf of their fellow Tibetans. Or for another example, in South Korea in the 1970s and again in 2003, several labor activists burned themselves to protest the failure to adhere to labor laws and try to advance the cause of laborers. The suicide itself is sometimes aimed at trying to directly influence the opponent, the state usually. Quang Duc, for example, wrote a note before his death to the president of Vietnam asking him to accept a policy of religious tolerance towards all his subjects. But much more so, it seems to be directed towards third parties. So studies of protest suicide in Korea have found that most notes left by those who burned themselves were directed at third parties such as bystanders, other members of the aggrieved community, half-hearted activists. They seem to be geared at convincing others to take up the struggle or to double their efforts in the struggle or to be unified for the cause. One Korean student, for example, left a note saying, "Please don't let my death be in vain. Activists of all persuasions, I beg you." Some protest suicides are aimed at getting outsiders involved in the conflict, such as people from a different nation or a more powerful nation. It's not a coincidence that Quang Duc killed himself in front of several Western journalists, or that the monks who were witnessing his protest suicide had leaflets printed in English that they distributed to describe why he was killing himself and what their grievances were. A common cause of these conflicts, not the sole cause, but a major one, is some increase in social stratification. Some recent act of increased domination by the state or some segment of the state. There might have been some new restriction placed upon the citizens or upon a particular religious or ethnic group, something restricting their upward social mobility or their freedom of cultural expression. Often the last straw you see is the quashing of some other attempt to protest or take action. In the case of the Vietnamese protests, you had had peaceful rallies and marches that were broken up by government forces, raids against the pagodas to arrest the activist monks, and so forth. So in sum, the structure of protest suicide is one marked by relatively low closeness, but high inequality, and some recent increase in inequality, in which a group has lost standing and has been more intensely dominated than before. So this structure of political domination is the structure of protest suicide. Let's contrast political domination, though, with a kind of conflict structure that exists at the opposite end of the scale. And that's what I call, and these are all terms I might decide tomorrow I don't want anymore,